aproximadamente el 70%. Los accidentes aéreos se atribuyen al comportamiento y rendimiento humanos. Desde 1949, cuando se fundó la Ergonomics Research Society, instituciones y empresas han examinado las formas en que los factores humanos han contribuido a los accidentes y al comportamiento ineficiente en la industria de la aviación. El término factores humanos se utiliza para describir el estudio de las personas en sus situaciones de vida y trabajo, su relación con las máquinas, los procedimientos y el entorno que las rodea, y también su relación con otras personas. La palabra ergonomía se utiliza específicamente para describir el estudio del hombre en su entorno de trabajo, como la posición del asiento del piloto en relación con los instrumentos y los controles. El propósito del estudio de los factores humanos, según el psicólogo profesor Edwards en 1972, es optimizar la relación entre las personas y sus actividades mediante la aplicación sistemática de las ciencias humanas, integradas en el marco de la ingeniería de sistemas. El reconocimiento de que la educación en factores humanos era necesaria en toda la industria se puso de manifiesto trágicamente, cuando en Tenerife en 1977, 2 aeronaves colisionaron en tierra con una pérdida de 583 vidas. Un desastre que resulta casi en su totalidad de una serie de deficiencias en la aplicación de los factores humanos, principalmente una mala comunicación. Autoridades de aviación han tomado medidas para concienciar sobre la importancia de los factores humanos en accidentes y eficiencia, con la publicación, por ejemplo, de folletos y documentos de seguridad orientativos como el CAPS 19 del Reino Unido, sobre los conceptos fundamentales de la ergonomía. Las autoridades de aviación también exigen la enseñanza de los factores humanos a los pilotos en formación. Exigen formación periódica para los pilotos cualificados y han establecido un sistema de notificación de incidentes no punitivo, denominado CHIP en el Reino Unido, para que la tripulación pueda informar a la CIA sobre malas prácticas o incidentes de aviación. Este curso de formación basado en ordenador analiza los factores humanos que se establecen en el programa de estudios de JODA bajo el título de Psicología Básica de la Aviación. Ha de reconocer grupos, comunicación y cooperación con decoración, procesamiento de la información, error y comportamiento humanos, cognición, es mental y diseño y automatización de la cabina de mando. Resulta útil utilizar un modelo para ayudar a comprender los factores humanos, como el concepto de concha, diseñado por el profesor Edwards y desarrollado por Frank Hawkins. Adopta la forma de bloques, con las letras del modelo. En el centro del modelo, representado por la letra L de software vivo, se encuentra el piloto. No solo actúa por su cuenta, sino que también interactúa con los otros 4 bloques, que tienen aristas irregulares para reflejar que la interacción no siempre será fluida y sin problemas. Observaremos el componente central, el hombre, con bastante detalle. Las lecciones sobre procesamiento de información, errores y cognición tratan sobre las posibles causas de su bajo rendimiento. En la primera parte de este curso de formación basado en ordenador, analizamos la audición, el sistema nervioso, la circulación, el sueño y las áreas problemáticas de salud de los pilotos. Todas estas pueden ser la causa de una degradación del rendimiento en el componente central del modelo de la carcasa, el humano. Sin embargo, el piloto no actúa de forma aislada, sino que interactúa con los demás elementos del modelo. Esta interacción, como una discusión con otro miembro de la tripulación, puede ser la causa de un problema. El bloque etiquetado como S representa la interacción del componente central del software con el software, es decir, los aspectos no físicos de sus sistemas humano-máquina. Este software incluye elementos como procedimientos, manuales y listas de verificación, simbología y programas informáticos. Lo veremos en la lección sobre diseño de cabinas. Los problemas suelen ser menos tangibles en esta interfaz y en consecuencia son más difíciles de resolver. Por ejemplo, la mala interpretación de listas de verificación o gráficos. El bloque H representa el hardware. La interfaz entre el software y el hardware es la que más se suele tener en cuenta cuando se habla de sistemas hombre-máquina. Incluye el diseño de asientos que se adapten a las características de asiento del cuerpo humano. También incluye el diseño de pantallas de instrumentos y controles, que se ajusten a las características sensoriales y de procesamiento de información del usuario. La interfaz del hardware del software también se considerará en la lección sobre diseño de cabinas. El bloque E representa el entorno. El efecto del entorno, como las temperaturas extremas y la radiación en el componente central del software, se tuvo en cuenta en la primera parte de la lección sobre el estrés físico, sobre el rendimiento y las limitaciones humanas. El último bloque del modelo de la carcasa es otra L, otro software que representa personas distintas del componente central del modelo. La formación de la tripulación aérea y las pruebas de competencia se han realizado tradicionalmente de forma individual. Sin embargo, el hecho de que cada individuo de un grupo sea competente no significa que el grupo vaya a tener un rendimiento eficiente. En esta interfaz, nos ocupamos del liderazgo, la cooperación de la tripulación, el trabajo en equipo y las diferencias de personalidad. Es una interfaz muy importante que merece su propia disciplina llamada CRM, abreviatura de gestión de recursos de la tripulación. Esta interfaz de software en vivo se considera en las lecciones sobre individuos y grupos y comunicaciones. Empezaremos nuestro estudio de psicología en el piloto, considerando la primera de ellas, la naturaleza, y el comportamiento de los individuos y los grupos.
In this lesson, we will look at the differences in the behaviour of individuals and how groups of people behave differently from individuals. We will then look at how this applies in the cockpit environment. Personality traits are innate, inherited through the genes. They are deep-seated characteristics, such as susceptibility to illness, and they constitute the essence of a person. They are stable and resistant to change. One of the greatest challenges in psychology is to understand how much personality people bring into the world, their genetic nature, and how much the environment, conditions and events affect them after they arrive, which is known as nurture. One can think of genetics or nature as roughly defining a broad range of potential abilities, such as IQ, and nurture as pushing a child up or down within this range. A child first develops an awareness of himself as an entity, separate and distinct from the environment surrounding him, because other people respond to him as a separate and autonomous object. This is called self-concept. As he grows, his personality is gradually developed by social interaction with other people. If his behaviour attracts approval and praise, he will continue with that behaviour. But if his behaviour meets with disapproval, he may change his behaviour. Personality is therefore the term used to embrace all the behavioural characteristics associated with an individual, and personality is extremely important when dealing with others. It refers to the total organisation of the individual's motives, attitudes, beliefs, and ways of perceiving and behaving. While we are looking at personality, we should distinguish it from attitude. Attitude, such as how one approaches illness, is a way of believing and feeling about an object or class of objects. Some people may ignore a cold, whereas others may believe it is the end of the world. Behaviour is the outward result of both personality and attitude. However, behaviour is not always the natural outcome, as behaviour can be controlled. We may not like a person we fly with, but we seldom tell them that. Because we have some control over our behaviour, it is possible to form good and bad habits. We all make assessments of personality in any social encounter, frequently by appearance and dress. Indeed, individuals are classified into 3 groups, the first of which is ectomorphs. They are tall, thin and fragile, and are considered to be introspective, sensitive and nervous. Endomorphs are soft and round in physical appearance, and we tend to think of them as easygoing, sociable, and self-indulgent. Mesomorphs appear physically hard, muscular, and rectangular, and are considered to be psychologically restless, energetic, and insensitive. Our individual assessment of someone may, of course, be completely wrong. One may hope that the endomorph captain will be a good laugh on a long trip, whereas he turns out to be surly, bossy, and the last person one would wish to spend 5 days with at close quarters. A more reliable assessment of personality can be obtained by well-established interview techniques and questionnaires. Prospective pilots are frequently assessed for their psychological profile, even before they join a study course. For example, is he a team player? Although not an exact science, there are 4 types of personality according to Hans Eysenck. Extroversion, with its opposite, introversion, and anxiety, also known as neuroticism, with its opposite, stability. At the very basic level, extroversion may be associated with boldness, impulsive behaviour, and sociability. Introversion may be associated with timidness, controlled behaviour, and seclusion. Anxiety is normally linked to emotional instability, tension, and suspiciousness. Stability may be linked to reliability, consistency, and relaxed behaviour patterns. As extroversion and anxiety are on different axes of the Eysenck model, some people may be anxious and extroverted. Others may be anxious and introverted. Naturally, most people have a personality near the crossroads of the 2 axes. But as deviation from the average increases, we find that the anxious extrovert will be regarded as aggressive and changeable. The stable introvert is regarded as thoughtful and controlled. The anxious introvert will be seen as sober and pessimistic. And the stable extrovert is seen as responsive and easygoing. Personality is a factor in many aviation accidents. The anxious extrovert tends to have accidents in which risk-taking is involved, whereas the anxious introvert tends to underperform and mismanage his task when under pressure. The ideal pilot must be self-disciplined and have the ability to control internal emotions and external actions. This places him in the stable extrovert sector of the personality model. Crew members have to work together as a team, but their individual personalities will dictate their interactive style. This interactive style can be defined in several ways. In his work on leadership behaviour typologies, W.J. Reddin identifies 8 management styles, which he portrays in a 3-dimensional grid. At one end of the grid, there are 4 rather ineffective styles, called missionary, compromiser, deserter, and authoritarian or autocrat. The missionary likes to be liked and is too democratic. The deserter takes no responsibility at all. The compromiser is easily persuaded and responds to the most recent pressure. The 4th of these ineffective types is quite common. He is the authoritarian individual, who will not tolerate dissent from subordinates. But when confronted by someone of a higher status, he will become submissive. This kind of person has a clear perception of hierarchy. At the effective end of the grid, there are 4 management styles called developer, bureaucrat, benevolent autocrat, and executive. The developer can motivate people and believes in delegation, but he is not authoritative. The bureaucrat only wants to be effective, and as a result, he has neither people nor a goal as a priority. The benevolent autocrat believes in his own ability, but he can also inspire subordinates. He likes to take over in a crisis. The 4th and fully effective style is the executive. He achieves higher morale and productiveness from his crew. He is a born leader. that styles can change, so that a non-authoritarian or submissive first officer may become an authoritarian captain, because he can, to a large degree, choose his behaviour. Redin states that there are two main factors that characterise interactive style. The first concerns the achievement of the task, known as goal-directed style, G. The second concerns keeping the team happy, known as person-directed style, P. If we create a two-dimensional model out of the Redin grid with axes representing P and G, then individuals can be classified as a plus or minus combination of P and G. An individual can therefore have one of the following combinations: P plus G minus, P plus G plus, P minus G minus, or P minus G plus. In general, the G plus person will be a company man, someone who wants to complete the task as his priority, whereas the G minus person will care little for the job and will put little effort into his work. The P plus person will put his colleagues' needs first and will consult them, whereas a P minus person couldn't care less about other team members. The job which the individual has may, to a large degree, dictate the interactive style. For example, the captain will have as part of his brief the need to avoid extra expense for his airline, such as by paying additional allowances to his crew if the duty day extends into a higher band. This job requirement makes his interactive style G+. On the other hand, a trade union representative will have his members' interests as a priority, making him a P+. It is considered that the ideal pilot has a P plus G plus style. Let us now look at the dynamics of groups or teams. A group implies that certain characteristics are shared amongst those present, which sets them aside from others and which gives them a sense of belonging. It also implies shared goals, values, interests and motives. Within any team or group, individuals have to work together, and a different attitude is required, sometimes called groupthink. A flexibility of thought, an ability to listen to others, and an appreciation of mutual interdependence are some of the factors required to make an effective team. When a team works well together, there is said to be group cohesion. The effectiveness of an individual within the group depends on several factors, personality being one, which we have already considered. Other factors include ability, status, and role. The ability of an individual to complete a task depends on many things: his knowledge, his experience, and his application to the task. It is how others perceive his ability, in conjunction with his interactive style, which will determine what others in the team think of him. People will more readily accept deficiencies in personality, such as a coarse nature, if they perceive an ability to do the job properly. Conversely, someone who is incompetent, as well as having a poor interactive style, will not be a good team player. Individual status will play a large part in the decision-making process within the team. So, a captain's opinion will carry more weight than that of a first officer. However, status can be dangerous on a flight deck if no one is willing to challenge the decisions of a captain, especially one who is authoritarian. Different cultures value status differently. In Western cultures, challenging authority is regarded almost as character building, whereas Far Eastern cultures respect status immensely, and challenging the captain would be unthinkable. The third factor which determines interpersonal behaviour within the team is role. On the flight deck, the role of a pilot changes, depending upon whether they are the handling pilot, that is the one flying, or the non-handling pilot, who will speak to air traffic and perform other tasks. A person's role will also influence other people's expectation of how that role should be fulfilled. For example, a captain would be expected to behave soberly when the whole crew goes out for a meal, and wild behaviour, on his part, would undermine his authority. The last two factors that we have looked at, role and status, may be the cause of conflict. For example, two senior captains on a flight deck will have to fulfill different roles, one as captain, the other as co-pilot. Both individuals would have to manage such a situation properly. Let us now look at group behaviour. Where time permits, decisions made by a group will tend to be better than the average decision by a member of that group. The group's problem-solving ability will, however, seldom improve on the problem-solving ability of the ablest member of the group. When decisions are made by a group, certain behaviour patterns have been observed, not all of which are conducive to making the best decisions. For example, people like to conform to the majority view. The greater the majority in favour of one proposal, the less likely it is that individuals will propose an alternative, especially if it is radically different. Compliance, that is agreeing with a request, depends very much upon the way the request is posed. If a request is made, for example, that crews accept a cut of 10% in their allowances, it is more likely to be complied with if an earlier request had been made for a cut of 15%, or if a cut of 5% had already been agreed. Persuasion has no place in group decision-making. If differences of opinion cannot be solved by airing the problem and coming to a logical conclusion, the group cannot be said to be working effectively. Risky shift describes how groups of individuals are more likely to make risky decisions than individuals on their own. The reason for this behaviour is twofold. The individual feels he can share the blame if something goes wrong when he is in a group, and those with risky views are likely to be more influential. Group duration will also have an effect on decisions. It used to be the practice, especially in the military, for crew members to remain together for several flights, known as constituted crews. It had the advantage that the members got to know and depend upon each other. However, there were the far greater disadvantages of complacency and the fact that new crew members could not rely on standard procedures, as the old crew may have modified them to suit themselves. The practice in commercial airlines is not to have constituted crews, so that bad habits are not developed. Consequently, in a large airline, flight crews might fly together only once or twice in their career. Within teamwork, we need to distinguish between coordination, coaction, and cooperation, although there is considerable overlap. Everyone in the company will have the same goal, namely the profitability of the company, but individuals' interaction will be different. Coordination describes the formal allocation of separate dependent tasks, such as one pilot being the handling pilot, while the other completes the other tasks. Coaction is defined as working in parallel, and largely independently, towards a common goal. On board an aircraft, the flight and cabin crew have different tasks, which are largely independent. However, they both have the same goal, namely the safe and efficient completion of the flight. Cooperation means generally working together, but not necessarily at the same task, and perhaps with considerable overlap. For example, the flight crew may have been told that they can have an earlier landing slot. This will necessitate the cabin crew cooperating by speeding up their cabin service, in order to make the cabin secure for landing. The dynamics of groups have been studied a great deal by many organisations, such as the military, large financial companies and universities, because of the need to reduce errors in group decision-making. Here are some of the guidelines generally accepted for improving decision-making in groups. Avoid arguing for your personal judgments, as you may not be right. Approach the task on the basis of logic. Avoid changing your mind only in order to reach agreement or to avoid conflict. You are a member of a team and your input is required. Avoid conflict-reducing techniques, such as a majority vote or middle course strategy. Make the correct decision, not just an acceptable decision. View differences of opinion as helpful rather than a hindrance to decision-making. In addition to these guidelines, continuous training is an accepted part of improving decision-making. Simulator training, crew resource management, CRM training, also called multi-crew cooperation, MCC training, and line-oriented flying training, LOFT, are all ways of improving crew standards. These courses are practical in nature and frequently involve team games. They deal with what are generically called human factors, that is, the topics which we are considering in this CBT course: decision-making, types of error, and so on. An essential member of any group is the leader, whether he is the chairman of a committee or the captain of an aeroplane. Leadership can be defined as the ability to get work done with and through others, while at the same time winning their confidence, respect, loyalty, and willing cooperation. No one is born a leader, and like other skills, leadership can be learned and developed. A good leader will tend to have the following characteristics: social maturity, self-motivation, achievement orientation, self-confidence, and communication skills. The three most important guidelines for a leader to follow in order to reach the best decision and to maintain the morale of the team are: he should avoid giving any indication of his own opinion at the outset of any discussion, as this will hamper open discussion. He should solicit the views of the others and look for doubts and dangers. He should explain why a decision has been made and why other suggestions were not implemented. In other words, he should make everyone feel part of the team. Leaders are nothing without followers. When decision-making, both leaders and followers in a group should try to adhere to the following guidelines. They should not avoid airing their reservations and anxieties. When asked for a point of view, they should give it, regardless of whether it is different from that of others. Opinions should be given without emotion. Individuals should avoid swearing and being abusive. If a danger is known, this should be expressed. It will not help you in a crash to know that you were correct. An old Chinese proverb is appropriate: tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll understand. We saw earlier that the interactive styles of individuals in a group can be categorized as goal-directed, G, or person-directed, P. In 1964, Robert Blake and Jane Mouton set out in their book The Managerial Grid, The Key to Leadership Excellence, a way of describing leadership style based upon the GP model. It follows the concept that leaders vary from 1 to 9 in their concern for people and their concern for getting things done. By using a grid, a person's leadership style falls into one of 5 categories, namely: authoritarian, where the goal is everything and the people are of little concern. This scores 9 on the horizontal axis and 1 on the vertical axis, similar to G plus P minus. Country club style, which scores 1 and 9, similar to G minus P plus. Impoverished style, which scores 1 and 1, similar to G minus P minus. Middle of the road, or organisation man style. This is the person who likes the status quo. He scores 5 and 5. There is no equivalent PG description. Team management style. In this case, the leader manages to combine a concern for the goal and concern for the people in the team. His score is 9 and 9, similar to G plus, P plus. Individuals are asked to score from 1 to 9 a series of statements about goals, such as, "Nothing is more important than accomplishing a goal." Then they are asked to score a series of statements about people, such as, "I honour other people's boundaries." By plotting a line for the G score, for example 6, against a line for the P score, for example 6, the individual's leadership type is found. A team management style of 9G9P is the ideal style, similar to the G+P+ interactive style of the ideal pilot. One member of the cockpit crew will usually be senior to the other, and he will therefore have greater authority. This is called the authority gradient. The captain's task is to achieve a compromise which maintains the authority gradient without losing the support of the crew members. If we apply the analysis of leadership and interactive styles to the cockpit, it is considered that there are 3 styles of cockpit environment: the autocratic cockpit, the laissez-faire cockpit, and the synergistic cockpit. In the autocratic cockpit, the captain's interactive style is authoritarian. Here are some of his less attractive characteristics. He decides and imposes his decisions without consultation. He takes no account of others' opinions. He rarely delegates. He makes general comments which teach nothing. He is isolated from the rest of the crew. He considers forcefully made suggestions as criticism. And he encourages a tense, non-communicative cockpit. By the very nature of the way that the cockpit is run, the authoritarian captain is normally overloaded in the event of a problem, and may even hide an inherent weakness or lack of experience by his gruff behaviour. Faced with such a captain, crews tend to react in a stereotype manner. If there is more than one co-pilot, or if there is a double crew, they are more likely to talk to each other than talk to the authoritarian captain. There is greater danger in a 2-man crew, as the co-pilot has to deal with the authoritarian captain alone. He may remain quiet, hoping for the flight to end. He may confront the captain, or be aggressive to a member of the cabin crew. Worst of all, the co-pilot may become resentful, introspective, and lose his focus or situational awareness. Despite all the unpleasantness of an authoritarian captain, his style may well be appropriate in an emergency when he gives clear orders and requires immediate responses. In the laissez-faire cockpit, the captain's interactive style is very relaxed. Here are some typical characteristics. He remains passive. He allows others to make decisions. He makes few suggestions. He makes neither negative nor positive judgment. He encourages a relaxed cockpit with non-aviation conversations. He aims to please the crew. In other words, he is a P+ leader with a country club style. This may sound very pleasant, but it is the most dangerous style of cockpit because there will be little authority. Indeed, the authority gradient is flat. There is little synergy, and there is a tendency not to keep each other informed. Finally, we have the ideal, the synergistic cockpit. The authority gradient exists, but the other members of the crew are involved in decision-making and tasks. The crew's interactive style can be called P+, G+, and the cockpit management would score 9 and 9 on the Blake-Mouton grid for being team management. Use the mouse to scroll through the attributes of the captain in a synergistic cockpit. This brings us to the end of the lesson on individual differences and interpersonal relationships. But the theme is continued in the next lesson on communication and cooperation. Closely related to the lesson on the behaviour of individuals and groups is this lesson on communication and cooperation between individuals. Communication can be defined as the effective transmission of a message. Because the ineffective transmission of messages has led to so many accidents, pilots must be very careful about what they say and how they say it. Indeed, saying nothing can speak volumes. Paul Watzlawick, a leading communication theorist who died in 2007, propounded several axioms about communication. His first and best-known axiom was, "One cannot not communicate." His other axioms deal with the way that communication also reveals things about the relationship of the parties, metacommunication, such as the authority gradient that we saw in the lesson on individuals and groups. Firstly, let us look at some of the obvious requirements for effective communication. The source and the receiver should speak the same language, which would not only include speaking the same tongue, but also the same dialect. Any slang or jargon used should also be understandable. Sentences should be correctly formed, and where possible, unambiguous. Gestures and attitudes should duplicate and reinforce the spoken word, such as the hand gestures by cabin crew during the safety briefing to passengers. The environment should allow clear communication, so noise levels should be low and distractions kept to a minimum. The context of the communication, such as on an approach to land, will affect the meaning of words, such as gear down. This could be a question, gear down. It could be an order, gear down, or confirmation of an action completed, gear down. Punctuation is also important, as in these two sentences. Woman without her man is useless. Woman, without her, man is useless. Is it possible to identify the components of communication? In 1960, the communication theorist David Berlow thought that there were four main elements: source, message, channel, and receiver. He called this the SMCR model. The first component of communication is the source, which will be an individual, such as the captain, or a group, such as the cabin crew or the management of the employing company. Berlow placed great emphasis on the relationship between the source and the receiver. There are many factors which affect both the source and the receiver, such as their communication skills. The greater the communication skills, the better should be the communication. But this may not be true if the source and the receiver have different communication skill levels. For example, there is no point in a manager of the airline delivering a detailed talk to his staff if he uses management speak, which no one understands. The attitude of the source towards the receiver, or the receiver towards the source, may be relevant. A captain who thinks that his crew members are a bunch of idiots is less likely to communicate well with them. Or if the crew think the pilot is an idiot, they are less likely to listen intently to him. The level of knowledge which both source and receiver have will also be relevant to the success of the communication. There would be little point delivering a lecture on turbine engines to a class of students who have not yet mastered the principle of the wheel. Finally, the social system and culture of the parties may reflect upon their acceptance of a communication. For example, in some Far Eastern cultures, it may be difficult to challenge the view of a superior, and this will obviously limit the content of a communication. Once a decision has been made to communicate, the second component is the message, which is behaviour in a physical form, such as speech, gestures, writing, and so on. The way that the message is treated will affect its content. For example, in preparing his copy for a newspaper, a journalist will select words which he thinks his readers will understand. He may be selective in his use of facts, and he may choose to structure the article by using a larger typeface for emphasis. The source then has to choose a medium or a code for transmitting his message, such as his voice, music, or the muscles of his hands or face. This is known as encoding. The third component of Berlow's analysis of communication is the channel of communication, which is one or more of the 5 senses of hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, and tasting. These are the ways in which the receiver receives the message. The receiver then decodes the message into a format which he can understand. In the fourth component of communication, the receiver applies his communication skills, knowledge, attitudes, social system and culture in order to interpret the message from the source. The interpretation of the message may not, however, be the meaning intended by the source. How would you interpret these words? Eats, shoots and leaves. Take time to examine Berlow's model of communication before continuing. Before we look in greater detail at communication, some other terms need to be defined. 1 bit of information means the quantity of information required to reduce the uncertainty of the receiver by 50%. A dialogue is a series of communications on the same subject between a source and a receiver. Hypertext is the unspoken or implicit message in a communication. For example, the question, "Where's the nearest pub?" may have a hypertext of "I need the toilet" or "I need a drink." The implicit message will vary with the context. Verbal communication simply means the use of spoken words. How these words are delivered will embellish their meaning. For example, a shrill tone may suggest urgency. Non-verbal communication means body language. Eye contact, facial expression, gestures, and physical contact all convey additional information. For example, a long stare and a quiet voice saying "hello" may be pleasant, whereas the same words spoken by a person with a stormy appearance may not be so alluring. Different cultures respond differently to body language. A raised finger means "wait a minute" in one culture, but it may mean something quite different, possibly offensive, in a different culture or age group. Personal space means the area around us, into which we do not want other people to come, unless it is on our own terms. An unwanted face close to one's own may even imply aggression. Meta-communication covers all the varieties of body language, facial gestures, the tone and pitch of our voice, etc. Indeed, research has shown that up to 80% of communication can be other than by the spoken word. Very often, communication takes the form of question and answer. The purpose of a question may be to elicit information, or it may be to seek confirmation. It depends upon the context, the wording, and the tone. The question may also be worded to produce a particular answer. For example, a pilot who has lost his situational awareness and who asks, "That is Oxford, isn't it?" is far more likely to receive the answer yes than no. This is known as a leading question. Questions can also be categorized as either open or closed questions. Open questions, also called implicit questions, require either a single deduction or multiple deductions before an answer is given. For example, a captain may ask, "In view of the weather, what should we do?" This will require the co-pilot to consider various things, such as the type, position and configuration of the aircraft, the type and proximity of the weather, the dangers that such weather may pose, the aircraft fuel state, the availability of air traffic control or airport facilities, and the qualifications of the crew. To reveal the advantages of open questions, click on the blackboard. A second opinion or group decision is brought into play, thus probably improving the quality of the eventual conclusion. Normally, more factors are investigated, thereby reducing the chances of important considerations being overlooked. The deductions of the questioner are checked, and knowledge is extracted from the responder, which can be assessed by the questioner. Because of this advantage, the open question is widely used in teaching and instructing techniques. However, there are disadvantages to open questions. Click on the blackboard to reveal them. The responder may not fully understand the implications of the question, and he may consider irrelevant facts. Discussion may ensue and thereby delay a decision. Discussion may divert attention from remaining focused on the main problem. They are prone to misunderstandings, which may not be identified, as both parties are talking at cross purposes. They are prone to diversions, which may not be detected. On the other hand, closed questions, also called explicit questions, are straightforward and require a simple answer, such as a yes or no. For example, the question, "Are we on the right track?" would require a reply of either yes or no. The advantages of closed questions are: the question and the reply are usually quicker than with open questions. The meaning of the questions is usually clear. Both the questioner and the responder are usually on the same wavelength. And misunderstandings are quickly identified and clarified. Closed questions also have disadvantages. Namely, important factors may be overlooked. The assumption that the question contains enough information for an informed answer may be incorrect, and the responder may not feel as included in the topic under discussion as if he had been asked an open question. Let us now apply some of the theory about communication to the workplace, in particular to the cockpit. However, there is an old flying adage which puts any communication into context, and that is, your priorities are aviate, navigate, communicate. There are always a lot of things going on in the cockpit, such as the instrument scan and keeping a lookout. So one's concentration may be elsewhere. Communication in the cockpit therefore needs to be efficient and professional. Unless the aircraft is on autopilot or in a cruise, unnecessary chatter will be a distraction, especially during an approach to land when the workload is heavy. Even essential communication, such as the co-pilot advising the captain of a runway direction during preparations for landing, can be a distraction to the pilot, who may be in the middle of checking something else. Where possible, the person interrupting should remind the other person of what he was doing before the interruption. Great care should also be taken to listen actively to what is being said, especially if one is expecting to hear a particular message. For example, after a request to change altitude, when the flight is going according to plan, the pilot might anticipate receiving the reply, "Approved," from air traffic control, whereas the actual spoken message is an approval to a different altitude from that requested. That is why clearances, such as an altitude change, must always be read back, and the language must always be the standard professional language of aviation. One of the causes of the worst air accidents ever on the ground in Tenerife in 1977 was poor communications, including the use of non-standard language. A KLM 747 was cleared for takeoff, while a Pan Am 747 was cleared to backtrack on the same runway. They collided, and 583 people were killed. We have already seen in the Berlo model how effective communication depends upon the skills, the knowledge level, and the culture of both the source and the receiver. Berlo also stated that it depends upon the way the message is treated. If there is a mismatch in any of these elements, communication may not be effective. Other factors, such as interpersonal differences, will also result in poor communication. The authoritarian-style captain, working with the missionary-style first officer, are unlikely to produce a balanced and equal discussion. Similarly, a very experienced captain and a newly qualified first officer are unlikely to generate a meaningful discussion of any problem, unless both of them consciously apply good communication techniques. Indecision about whether or not to say anything, such as in the case of a very junior first officer, is called intrapersonal conflict. Interpersonal conflict is the poor relationship between two or more people. How can conflict and consequent poor communications be avoided on the flight deck? A management discipline called Crew Resource Management, CRM, has been established to resolve this and other team-related problems and to optimize crew cooperation. Various techniques are suggested for ensuring good communications, such as making a tactful inquiry to clarify queries or to overcome misunderstandings. There is nothing wrong with saying, "I don't understand that decision," or with asking questions, preferably open questions. Concentrate on what is being said. Listen actively. Be willing to change your viewpoint in the light of what is being said, but do not act until you have received or given all relevant information. If you are listening, let the other person see this. It is discouraging not to receive an intelligent response to your opinions. Even disagreement is preferable to the uncertainty caused by no response at all. Remember that sulking, resentment, and a lack of cooperation have no place on the flight deck, even if this is your normal practice at home. Message length should not be too long, otherwise the receiver may not be able to absorb all the information. A technique for maintaining active listening is to stop the flow of information by asking, "In summary, are you saying that?" Unnecessary advocacy in support of an argument should be avoided. That is not to say that all relevant arguments should not be put forward. Body language is important. Consider whether you are scowling all the time, smiling deferentially, or laughing nervously. Body language can either bolster or undermine a message. Feedback is important, The good captain should always explain why an opinion has been rejected, and he should state whether or not a course of action is working. In the final analysis, the captain is in command, and he may need to make unpopular decisions. He may have to arbitrate in a conflict between crew members. His authority should be respected, unless it is clear that he is putting the aircraft or passengers in danger. Because flight crews sit side by side, body language may be limited, and so clear oral communication is even more important. Here are some methods for ensuring good cockpit communication. Take great care over the choice of words or intonation used. Keep sentences short. Phrases should be simple and unambiguous. Information should be parcelled into one subject at a time. Enunciate clearly. Speak slightly slower than in normal conversation. Give and expect responses. The whole point of communication is to achieve a mutual understanding, and this is usually so as to achieve a common goal, such as a successful flight through working together. You may recall from the lesson on individuals and groups that working together can be by coordination, the allocation of parts of a task to individuals, cooperation, which means generally working together but not necessarily at the same task and perhaps with considerable overlap, and co-action, which means performing different tasks but with the same goal. Very often, a series of actions needs to be carried out in accordance with an information base, such as a checklist. This is called cognitive synchronization. Temporal synchronization occurs when time is used as the basis with which to complete a series of actions. For example, the outbound leg of a holding pattern may be flown for 1 minute. Later, the exact time for leaving the hold will be given by air traffic control. Teamwork is essential for any successful commercial flight, and the word synergy is used to describe whether or not group performance exceeds the sum of the individual performances. Good synergy can be stated mathematically as 1 + 1 is greater than 2. The symbol of ancient Roman solidarity was the fasces, a bundle of twigs bound together showing strength in numbers. The same image appears on this Abraham Lincoln statue. Poor synergy can be stated as 1 + 1 is less than 2. It has been found that several types of attitude inhibit good synergy and contribute towards poor performance at stressful times. These attitudes are the anti-authority, the impulsive, the invulnerable, the macho, the resigned. To summarize, good communication is essential for efficient, safe teamwork. And where teamwork and synergy are good, one would expect the following conditions to exist. Team objectives are clearly understood by all members. All members are committed to the team objective. Mutual trust is high. Support for one another is high. Communications are open and reliable, not guarded. Team members listen to one another. They understand and are understood. The team is self-controlling. Conflicts are accepted and worked through. Members' abilities, knowledge and experience are fully used by the team. This brings to an end our lesson on communication and cooperation.
In this lesson on information processing, we will consider how information is received by humans, how it is considered, and how a response may follow. We receive information through our senses: sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. When flying an aircraft, the pilot must observe, interpret, and then react to information received from the senses, both in the cockpit and in the environment outside the aircraft. Information processing can be represented as a model or flowchart. This captures the main elements of the process, from receipt of information to making a decision. The process starts with the stimuli of sounds, smells, sights, sensations, and tastes. These are received by the receptors and sensory stores. As long as the stimulus is large enough to get over the sensory threshold, for example, a noise is loud enough to be heard and infrequent enough not to become accepted, known as habituation, then it will register in the attention mechanism. This information is interpreted into a meaningful message with the help of our stored experience and knowledge, which we can call our perception of stimuli. In reaching an interpretation of these stimuli, our central decision maker relies upon our short-term and long-term memories. The central decision maker then decides upon a course of action. It may be an unconscious action, called a motor action, such as changing gear in a car, or a conscious action, such as selecting an engine close-down program. The effect of this action will then feed back as a stimulus, and the process continues until the required response to the original stimulus has been made. By using this model, it is possible to identify where any error has occurred. For example, the long-term memory may have suggested the incorrect Mayday radio frequency. Let us look in a little more detail at the elements of the model. The analysis of the inputs, which come from the outside world, are described as bottom-up or data-driven. The analysis of inputs, which come from prior knowledge and are stored in the long-term memory, are known as top-down or conceptually driven. An example of this would be that you observe a black shape in a park. The analysis of inputs from the outside world and from prior knowledge enable you to interpret the black shape as a Labrador. Where both types of analysis are present, which is the norm, it is called interactive processing. Stimuli, such as a bell ringing, are stored for a brief time after the input is finished, in what are called sensory memories. The ability to retain these stimuli for an ultra-short time is essential, as when they first arrive, one may not have the processing capacity to deal with them. The sensory memory for sound, or echoic memory, lasts for between 2 and 8 seconds, and enables one, for example, to recall the chimes of a clock even though one did not immediately concentrate on them. The sensory memory for sight, or iconic memory, only lasts between a half to 1 second, but 80% of information processed comes from the things we see and is therefore very important. On the screen, 8 keyboard letters were shown. Did you read the words black dog? Sensory receptors adapt fairly rapidly to stimuli. When first sensed, the receptors respond at a very high impulse rate, but gradually this will reduce and may ultimately produce no response at all. That is why we do not feel our clothes against our skin, nor do we notice the traffic after a while. This lack of response to continuing stimuli is called habituation. If the stimulus registers with the senses, it moves to the next phase and gets into our attention mechanism. However, there is no guarantee that we will pay attention to the correct or important stimulus. For example, two pilots may continue chatting, even though their peripheral vision may have observed a warning light flashing. Attention can be defined as the concentration of mental effort on sensory or mental events to enhance perception and performance. Distinguish this from vigilance, which is the degree of activation of the central nervous system. Due to the limitations of the central processor, we are generally unable to pay attention to a number of different items at the same time. Although attention can move quickly from one item to another, it can only deal with one item at a time, which means that a pilot must prioritize. This is known as single-channel processing. Attention can take several forms. Selective attention occurs when one is monitoring several sources of input, with greater attention being given to one or more sources which appear more important. A person can be consciously attending to one source whilst still sampling another in the background. This is known as the cocktail party effect, whereby one can be engrossed in a conversation, but one's attention is diverted as one hears one's name mentioned on the other side of the room. Distraction is the negative side of selective attention, such as when a pilot is receiving too much information. Divided attention occurs because our central decision-making channel can timeshare between a number of tasks. The pilot flying a visual approach will be dividing his attention between looking to maintain his approach and checking instruments. Whereas it would appear that he is working on a number of tasks at the same time, in reality, the central processor is spending a fraction of every second on a number of different tasks in turn. The mind always pays attention to something, but the danger for pilots is that attention management is poor, and that attention is paid to the incorrect stimulus. The amount and quality of attention paid to any task will be reflected in the performance of the task. Similarly, the extent to which we are ready to respond to a task, which is called arousal, also has a direct bearing upon performance. This relationship can be represented by an inverted U-curve on a graph. At times of low arousal, such as in the cruise, a pilot's attention may wander. Generating artificial workloads, such as a 5-minute position check, or making timed radio calls, may help to focus attention. At optimal arousal, such as on an approach which is going well, the central processor is at its most efficient and performance is at its best. At times of high arousal, there is a real danger of the central processor becoming overloaded. There may be too much information, called quantitative overload. Or the information may be too difficult to understand, which is called qualitative overload. A few of the symptoms of overload are a sharp degradation of performance, blinkered attention, and mood swings. Stress will obviously make things worse, and we will look at this in greater detail in the lesson on stress. After the information has been gathered and noted, it has to be interpreted or converted into a meaningful structure, that is, our perception of the information. This perception may or may not be correct. Take a look at this triangle and read what it says. Most people will read the first 3 lines, and because it's a well-known phrase, they believe that they know what's coming next. But look closely, and you will see that there is an extra "the." One could say that our perception is what we make of what we sense. two people seeing the same scene will, more than likely, describe it differently. For example, look at this scene and make a note of the order in which you perceive things. Did you first see a tree or people? What makes us see things differently are our mental models that we each have, based upon our past experiences and learning. One person may assess whether the tree is safe because of a past mishap. Another may assess the color of the leaves because of his interest in foliage. Perception is always subjective. The advantage of having mental models is that the brain can speed up the perception process. However, the disadvantage of the mental model is that stimuli may not be given adequate attention, with the result that we make the facts fit our mental model. A pilot may be expecting engine 1 to give trouble, and when an alarm is sounded, he may jump to the incorrect conclusion that it is indeed engine 1 that has the problem. It is in fact engine 2 that has the problem. For example, when unsure of one's aircraft's position, one may try to fit the map to what one sees on the ground and say, "That's Oxford, isn't it?" because we are hoping to see Oxford. Seeking information which confirms our model and ignoring other evidence is known as confirmation bias. Our perception of a situation is also influenced by our mental schemas, that is, our mental representations of categories of objects, events, and people. For example, most people have a mental schema of a football match, which is a collection of images. It might include the ground, the players, the noise, crowds, and even hot dogs. Such mental schema may be unhelpful, as an actual situation may be colored by the content of the mental schema. For example, the question, "Was there a hot dog stall there?" may be answered by, "Well, there usually is. I expect there was one there." Our perception of the world is greatly influenced by our vision, and the lesson on cognition looks at this in detail. However, it is worth recalling here that near objects occlude or obscure distant objects, whilst objects at a distance lose their clarity, making it difficult to judge form and size, and their angle, subtended at the retina, becomes smaller with increased distance. Retinal size is of particular importance to the pilot. For example, in the final stages of an approach, the pilot is likely to judge his height above the ground from the retinal size of the runway. To make this judgment, however, he must have a stored expectation of the likely size and slope of the runway. For example, if the runway slopes up more than he expects, it will appear larger than he expects, and it will give the impression that he is too high and going to overshoot. He may then fly lower, in order to comply with the expected visual model of being 3 degrees above an assumed flat runway, but his flight path will end short of the runway. We can see from the information processing model that the central decision maker is served by the short-term and long-term memories. It is the attention mechanism which selects what information is passed to the short-term memory. Information can be stored here for up to 20 seconds, but it will then be lost. This may be long enough for its use. For example, approach air traffic control may tell the pilot to change frequency to ground air traffic control.
Ground is on 121.9er.
Lufthansa 4 Lima, the old copy, 0.9er. Hello.
The pilot will remember the new frequency long enough to use it, but he will then forget it. acoustic information is considered easier to retain than visual information, as it is easier to rehearse in full. For example, telephone inquiries may give you a number, and you will no doubt repeat this number to yourself until you have finished using it, and then it will be binned. The short-term memory is also limited in the amount it can contain. It is considered that an average person can retain 7 plus or minus 2 unrelated items. Read this list once and see how much of it you can repeat in the correct order. It's not easy. But it is easy to improve the number of remembered items, for example by association. Make a story out of the words. Alternatively, create a mnemonic out of the first letters of the words, even adding letters, such as vowels, to make sense out of the letters. In the case of numbers, divide them into chunks of 2 or 3, as is done by the French telephone network. Try these two lines of numbers and see which is easier to remember. The short-term memory can easily be displaced by an interruption or a new stimulus. For example, if you have been given a telephone number, which you are trying to remember, and then you are given another number, it is highly likely that the first number will be displaced by the second, or that neither number is remembered. The long-term memory receives information from the short-term memory which has been rehearsed, and it will be stored indefinitely. For example, the alphabet learned in primary school will be remembered forever once it has been rehearsed and hence learned properly. There are 3 categories of long-term memory: semantic, episodic, and procedural. The first 2 are known as declarative memory. The semantic memory stores general knowledge of the world, storing information which enables us to answer such questions as, "Do all birds fly?" It is believed that the semantic memory holds concepts that are represented in a dense network of associations. It is generally thought that once information has entered the semantic memory, it is seldom lost. When we are unable to remember a word, it is because we are unable to find where the word in the semantic memory is stored, not because it has been lost from the store. Episodic memory stores events or episodes in one's life. For example, seeing a wedding. Episodic memory is not as accurate as semantic memory. Episodic, more than semantic memory, is subject to influence and deterioration. It is heavily influenced by one's assumption about what happened. For example, one might remember a young person lying on a pavement. But this image may be incorrectly interpreted as a person who was drunk, whereas the person may have had a fit or had been assaulted. One might add on non-existent images, such as beer cans, and other people, because one has seen a beer bottle in previous similar situations. Time will also reduce the clarity and accuracy of episodic memory. Similarly, variations may appear on repeating the story, but the teller believes the revised version to be accurate. Recollection of events can also be influenced by suggestion. For example, when asked to estimate a car's speed, the answer may be higher if the questioner asks, "What speed was the car doing when it screeched round the corner?" Amnesia affects episodic memory more than semantic memory. After a head injury, a person may be unable to remember an event, such as a wedding, episodic memory, but will still be able to take the lift to the 8th floor, semantic memory. There are two forms of amnesia. One is called anterograde amnesia, in which new events in the short-term memory are not transferred to the permanent, long-term memory. The sufferer will not be able to remember anything for more than a brief period after it occurs. The other type is called retrograde amnesia, which is an inability beyond ordinary forgetfulness to recall some memory of the past. There are several causes of amnesia, such as a head injury, a stroke, a viral brain infection, a tumor, or a severe emotional shock, known as dissociative amnesia. Not being able to remember last night's heavy drinking is not a symptom of amnesia. Alcohol abuse can result in events not being transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. Long-term alcohol abuse, resulting in a vitamin B1 deficiency, can cause permanent damage to the memory function. Let us go back to the model. The long and short-term memory inputs and stimuli have been interpreted into a perception of the situation, and so a decision is made as to what action to take. For example, on seeing a temperature gauge go into the red, a pilot may throttle back the power. This action will have consequences which must be reviewed. The action will produce another stimulus, such as a temperature gauge going down if the action was successful. However, if the pilot throttles back the wrong engine, the high temperature will remain and the pilot will have to review his actions and the problem. As we saw earlier, semantic and episodic memories are known as declarative memories. The third type of long-term memory is procedural memory, sometimes called non-declarative memory. A characteristic of procedural memory is that it involves a skill, something that is difficult to explain in words. An example of this is riding a bicycle or flying an aeroplane. Skills such as juggling, which may have required active concentration during the learning stage, can be executed independently of the decision-making process. These are called motor programs or motor skills. You will see from the model that there is a direct link from the attention mechanism to motor programs and onto actions without reference to the central decision maker. To develop a motor program, there are three distinct phases. The cognitive phase comes first, in which the learner thinks consciously about each individual action, such as learning to serve in tennis. Then comes the associative phase, in which the separate components of the overall action become integrated. Finally, the automatic phase, when the total maneuver can be executed smoothly without conscious mental effort. It is the ability to fly using these motor skills that enables the pilot to send and receive RT messages without losing control of the aircraft. The motor program flies the aircraft, and the central decision maker deals with the communication. However, when the process of flying becomes non-routine, as in an emergency, the pilot may need to go back temporarily to the associative phase, thereby using conscious learning and decision-making. One can use the analogy of changing from autopilot to manual flying. These three phases, the cognitive phase, the associative phase, and the automatic phase, are also called declarative knowledge, knowledge compilation, and procedural knowledge. Students must be familiar with both sets of terms. We will look in another lesson at the topic of errors, but for now, we should note that there are two types of error associated with motor programs, sometimes collectively called routine errors. These are action slips and habituation. Action slips usually occur at the selection stage. For example, the throttle, the black levers, may be closed, when what was needed was to lean the fuel supply, the red levers. Habituation, or environmental capture, occurs when an action is frequently made in the same environment. In response to the captain calling for gear down, the co-pilot may say 3 greens without actually lowering the gear. The only way to avoid these errors is for pilots to constantly monitor their own and their colleagues' actions and carry out checklists properly. The information processing procedure will be influenced by many factors, such as a trade-off between speed and accuracy. For example, a delay in making a decision after an engine failure on takeoff could be critical, and there will be pressure to take action, even before all available information has been processed. High levels of arousal will lead to faster but less accurate responses. An increase in age tends to lead to responses that are slower but more accurate. Auditory warnings are more likely to attract attention because they will always be heard, compared to visual stimuli, which may be in peripheral view only. However, auditory warnings are more likely to produce an incorrect response. Prepared responses to emergency situations are an integral part of flight safety training. But if the stimulus is unexpected, the pilot may choose the prepared response instead of a more calculated response. This is called an error of commission. For example, a pilot may have noticed engine instrumentation irregularities, and he has mentally prepared himself to close down a particular engine. An unrelated noise, such as a dropped food tray, may be sufficient to cause the pilot to shut down the engine. The time interval between the onset of a given signal and the production of a response to that signal is called the response time. In the simplest case, such as pushing a button when a light illuminates, the reaction time is about 0.2 of a second. In an actual incident at Manchester, an engine was shut down in less than a second following a bang heard before V1, which is the decision speed to take off. In this case, the correct decision was made. In another case, an emergency occurred after V1, and, as training has instinctively drilled the pilot to continue the takeoff and get the aircraft airborne, the pilot should have done so. But in this case, the pilot thought about the problem, identified it as the elevator, which would have made it actually impossible for the aircraft to fly, and as a result the pilot elected to stop the aircraft. The delay in the response in this case actually was the correct response and prevented multiple fatalities. Response times are relevant, but of paramount importance is making the correct response rather than a fast response. Take your time and do the task correctly, rather than have to start the task again or even make an incorrect response. We have seen that we can acquire skills or motor programs by learning and repetition, and we need to look briefly at the different types of learning. Classic or operant conditioning refers to the behaviorist approach of Pavlov, where the recipient is taught through physiological responses. Pavlov noticed that dogs in a laboratory salivated when they saw a white lab coat being worn, as they associated this with mealtime. An experienced pilot will similarly have an almost automatic response to a stall warning sound, but rather than salivating, the pilot will carry out the standard stall recovery. Insight, refers to data that is intellectually or cognitively understood and retained. For example, the way that a pilot sets up the onboard navigation equipment. Observational learning or imitation is very common and would include a student pilot following through as the instructor takes off and then taking off on his own afterwards. Experience refers to learning by our own mistakes. Even though older people may have slower response times, it has been found that their overall performance deteriorates little because of their experience. The quality of any type of learning depends on various factors, such as the intellectual capacity of the recipient, the quality of the communication between the transmitter and the recipient, and the applicability of the data. The place where the information was learnt is also relevant. It has been shown that it is easier to recall information when one is in an environment similar to that where the information was learned. Indeed, one research study shows that divers, who were asked to learn words underwater, recalled them better when underwater than on land. Consequently, procedures learned in a simulator will be recalled far better in a cockpit than if they were learned in a classroom. The motivation of the transmitter and the recipient is also relevant, as is overlearning. If one learns a subject in greater detail than is required, not only is recall improved, but the task itself is likely to be more resistant to stress. This concludes our lesson on information processing.
In this lesson, we will be looking at human behaviour, the way that decisions are made, the errors that humans make, and the ways in which those errors can be reduced. It is a very important topic in practice because approximately 70% of aircraft crashes are caused by human error. Human reliability can be defined as an individual functioning in the manner in which he is supposed to function. Studies of human error rates during the performance of a simple and repetitive task show that errors can normally be expected to occur about once in 100 times. This error rate is built into the human system and can increase with stress, fatigue, and other factors. But the error rate can also be reduced with practice, so that a frequency of 1 in 1,000 may be regarded as achievable. Factors which affect reliability are length of time of exposure to risk, degree of risk, mental and physical health, innate psychological characteristics, innate physiological characteristics, personality deficiencies, stress factors, experience, motivation, and skill level. If humans do not perform reliably, that is, they perform a mental or physical activity which does not achieve its intended effect, then we describe this as an error. Errors may be inconsequential, such as when a child is asked to turn off a cold water tap, but closes the hot water tap instead. But they may be catastrophic, as when workers at a nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island in the USA in 1979 incorrectly closed cooling pipe valves to a reactor, which led to a meltdown of the core of the reactor. It is not surprising, therefore, that wherever possible, rules, procedures and checklists are used to minimize human error, particularly where complex tasks are involved. Aircraft operation handbooks are a good illustration of this. Errors tend to be cumulative in nature. That is, the original error will tend to cause other errors to follow. For example, An erroneous maintenance procedure may lead to several accidents. This is known as an error chain. Not following the correct operational procedures led to the worst nuclear accident ever in Chernobyl in 1986, which resulted in thousands of deaths. Isolated errors have no further consequences, such as taking up a flower instead of a weed in a flower bed. Errors can be categorized in many ways, but the JAA refer to the following 4 types: faults, violations, slips, and omissions, and we will look at each in turn. The action taken satisfies the operator's intention, but the intention itself was incorrect. For example, flaps may be extended perfectly, but what was needed was to lower the undercarriage. A common cause of faults is an error of perception, such as misjudging the width of a runway, which results in landing either too short or too long on the runway. The pilot has performed his action as planned, but it was unintentionally the wrong action. Violations are also intention errors, but they are a case of intentionally taking the wrong action. They are a conscious breach of the rules or regulations, such as not following checklists or ignoring air traffic instructions. Slips, also known as lapses or action errors, are actions which are carried out incorrectly, such as instead of selecting 10-degree flaps, 30-degree flaps are selected. The action does not satisfy the intention, although the intention was correct. Finally, omissions, which are self-explanatory. For example, missing out an item on a checklist. Interruptions are frequently a cause of omissions. What then causes these errors? Broadly speaking, error generation can be caused by either internal or external factors. Internal factors can be either traits, which are relatively unchanging personal characteristics, or states, which are considered to be more or less within the control of the individual. Examples of traits are personality, lack of talent, inexperience, excess zeal, and lack of current experience. Examples of states are fatigue, drink or drug effects, life stress, and under or over arousal. External factors are those beyond the control of the individual, such as stress factors or stressors. This would include noise, family problems, and high or low task demand. Further examples of external factors that can lead to errors are company pressure, crew incompatibility, poor training, poor displays, and poor controls and equipment. The type of error made by an individual is very closely linked to the type of his behaviour at the time. Jens Rasmussen, a Danish ergonomics author, introduced a 3-level activity control model in the 1980s, the SRK model, which is particularly suitable for explaining pilots' learning techniques and their actions. The key distinction for Rasmussen between these 3 types of behaviour is whether or not the individual is engaged in problem solving at the time that the error occurred. In brief, skill-based behaviour is automatic. Rule-based behaviour is that for which a routine or procedures have been learned and are being followed, whilst knowledge-based behaviour requires the solving of a problem for which no procedures exist. Let us look at skill-based behaviour. Rasmussen states that behaviour at the skill-based level represents sensory motor performance during acts or activities that take place without conscious control, as smooth, automated and highly integrated patterns of behaviour. Riding a bike or an experienced pilot flying straight and level are examples of this. Errors in skill-based behaviour do not normally occur in novices, because they have to think about each action, and therefore the action is not automatic, and does not fall into the definition of skill-based behaviour. A necessary condition for the occurrence of a slip in skill-based behaviour is the presence of attentional capture, associated with either distraction or preoccupation. This means that wherever else the limited attentional resource is being directed at that moment, it will not be focused on the routine task in hand. Have you ever put the milk back in the cupboard and put the sugar in the fridge? Or have you gone upstairs to fetch something, then forgotten what it was you wanted? These are automatic actions, but there has been some unconscious distraction. Because virtually all adult actions have skill-based components, most errors are skill-based slips, and they generally involve a necessary departure from some well-established routine, such as automatic scanning of the ground in front of the feet while walking. Slips may be occasioned either by an intended deviation from normal practice, or by an alteration in the physical circumstances in which a routine is customarily executed. An example of an intended deviation would be agreeing to make a cup of coffee for a colleague whilst you personally drink tea. You return from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea. An example of an alteration in physical circumstances would be a pilot who is used to an aircraft with a 3-position fuel selector, left, right, off, flying an aircraft with only 2 positions, on, off. He is told of the new settings and says he understands, but when it comes to the time he normally changes tanks, he turns the fuel to the off position. The reason for the slips is clear. When making the tea, you fail to make an attentional check on your plan at the point where the initial common pathway, boiling the kettle, branched into making tea or coffee. In the case of the fuel selector, it was a failure to recall the changes in the environment, probably because of all the other things going on. The slips in these 2 examples arose because knowledge related to these changes was not accessed at the appropriate time, due almost invariably to attentional capture or distraction. In order to avoid such slips, checklists are prepared and type rating training is required. Many airlines limit their pilots to 3 types of aircraft at any one time because of the risk of information overload, occasioning slips. Rule-based and knowledge-based behaviour are only called into play after the individual has become conscious of a problem. Rule-based behaviour will be controlled by existing rules, such as a take-off drill. Knowledge-based behaviour deals with non-standard problems, that is, events that have no procedure, such as a mid-air collision. Rule-based behaviour is that for which a routine or procedure has been learned. Unlike skill-based behaviour, rule-based behaviour always requires a conscious decision to initiate the behaviour. Consider the case of being asked to fly from Denham to Shoreham. One cannot say, "I've never done that before. I can't go." The rule-based behaviour solution would require you to follow set procedures for correct preparation of the flight. Reference will be made to the correct maps and documents to obtain the required information of the route. The relevant NOTAMs will be checked, the weather information collated, details of the destination aerodrome will be looked up, and so on. Flying SIDS and STARS are good examples of rule-based behaviour. In short, pilots have rules and procedures which regulate both normal flight, such as Hazel checks before a stall practice, and abnormal flight, such as emergency drills. The rules are usually written down, and the more frequently used may be stored in the long-term memory, perhaps in the form of a mnemonic, such as FRIDA, the en route check. It is in the field of procedural training, that is rule-based behaviour, that simulation is used most frequently, since pilots cannot thoroughly practice emergencies whilst actually flying. Some procedures are too complicated to be reliably memorised, and thus they must be kept in some documentary form, such as checklists. Even in these cases, the pilot must retain a basic memory of how to access the correct information, for example by understanding the index. Thus, the general practice is to learn the immediate actions for an emergency, such as making a Mayday call with the required information: Mayday, 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 Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, Seneca 10 miles west of Wickham, 3,500 feet, heading 270, 4 on board, fire left engine, intend to land at Oxford. The subsequent actions, such as following the checklist and switching off systems, can be done later. Rule-based behaviours are generally robust in practice and have many strengths. Standardised procedures enable each crew member to know what other crew members should do in a selected situation, thereby acting as monitors of each other's actions. Errors of rule-based behaviour usually occur because of the application of the incorrect rule. For example, by confusing two red warning lights, such as the undercarriage unsafe light and the low voltage light. The use of auditory and visual warnings goes some way to resolving this problem. If a rule is used mistakenly, it will generally be a well-established, rather than a little-used rule, strong but wrong. It will also frequently have an application in a similar environment. For example, the throttle may be moved instead of the mixture lever, both of which are used with a similar frequency and at a similar time. It is unlikely that the radio frequency will be changed in place of lowering the flaps, because their functions are so dissimilar, even though they may be physically located next to each other. Departure from established rules is highly dangerous. For example, a ground proximity warning must not be ignored, and the mandatory rule to pitch up with full power should be obeyed. These prescribed rules are known as Standard Operating Procedures, SOPs, and should cover most eventualities. But where they do not, the pilot must rely on his experience and knowledge, which is what we will now look at. Finally, we come to knowledge-based behaviour, which is that applied when no procedure has been learned or established, such as when completing a jigsaw puzzle. However, situations where there are no rules or procedures to which a pilot can turn will be increasingly uncommon on sophisticated aircraft, because pilot involvement has been designed out as much as possible. Where a novel problem does occur, the pilot must use his knowledge and experience to design a plan for dealing with the situation, and this is done by the central decision-maker of the brain, using all the external stimuli and all of the information in the long-term memory. Humans will, if possible, avoid knowledge-based problem-solving because it is harder and more time-consuming than rule-based solutions. If one can fit one's actions within a well-tried procedure, one may feel more confident of the outcome than if one were to create a new solution. Professor James Reason has produced his generic error modelling system, which traces the path of human problem-solving through the 3 behaviour types of Rasmussen. His conclusion is that, when confronted with a problem, human beings are strongly biased to search for and find a prepackaged solution at the rule-based level before resorting to the far more effortful knowledge-based level, even where this is demanded at the outset. Only when people become aware that successive cycling around this rule-based route is failing to offer a satisfactory solution will the move down to the knowledge-based level take place. Take some time to examine this generic error modelling system model. However, knowledge-based behaviour is more prone to error than skill-based or rule-based behaviour for the reasons that follow. Where a decision at the knowledge-based level is necessary, the use of mental models is required, utilising all of the information available to the pilot from his environment. Evaluation of evidence, however, is not a straightforward process, and the weight placed on individual items will be influenced by a number of factors. The pilot will be heavily influenced by the probability of an occurrence. For example, a bang heard on takeoff could be a tyre bursting, a bird strike, or an engine failure. A burst tyre is the most probable cause, and so pilots may carry out initial drills for that event. Previous experience will also influence a decision. If a pilot recently experienced a component failure, such as an ASI not reading properly, he may look no further than for a faulty instrument if another faulty reading occurs. Whereas the cause may be something different, such as a bird strike to the pitot tube and leading edge of the wing, which will have additional consequences. The incoming information may be incomplete or ambiguous. The redness of the sky could be a setting sun, but it could also be the effect of a volcanic eruption, with the attendant dangers of flying through ash. Once a theory has been formed about a problem, such as not knowing one's exact position, people are reluctant to move away from that theory and start again with a new one. This is especially true if time is short, perhaps as the pilot has to comply with an ATC clearance. Or, if the captain has a strong personality, when he may find it difficult to start again, as it will be a difficult admission of error on his part. Individuals will seek information to confirm their theory rather than to test and challenge it. This is known as confirmation bias. This extract from an aviation chart shows two towns with remarkably similar features. Each has a major road running from northwest to the southeast, shown coloured green. Each has a railway, also running from the northwest to the southeast, shown coloured blue. And each has a railway running from east to roughly west, shown coloured pink. The towns are a similar size, and they are both the same distance from the coast. Add some scattered cloud and overconfidence, and we have the components for a wrong decision. The thing that is required for a correct decision is independent confirmation. In this case, a bearing could be taken from Dover VOR or Lydd VOR. A bearing from Manston NDB would be unhelpful, as Canterbury and Ashford are on a similar bearing. Even if the pilot reviews his decision, there is a tendency for him to review only the things that he has considered, and in the same order, causing a check-off illusion, rather than a systematic review of the relevant material. Out of sight, out of mind is a wholly appropriate saying for problem solvers. For example, an old battery may have been left some time ago in a storage compartment, but has now leaked and corroded some electrical cables. It has also been found that people have greater difficulty in identifying symptoms than in producing plausible solutions. This is reflected in the fact that everyone is happy if a reasonable, non-threatening explanation can be given. In an incident in Malaysia, a Boeing flew through the tops of some trees on the approach, and the noise was interpreted as an engine surge, a clearly less blameworthy event than a low approach. Only the subsequent demonstration of foliage in the undercarriage persuaded the crew that the approach may have been a little low.